Welcome to the Policy Center Live podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Charles Mcgee, Professor of Biological Systems Engineering for Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. Dr. Magee holds a PhD in Agricultural and Biological Engineering from Cornell University, a renowned Ivy League research university. He has been inducted into USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture Hall of Fame for his impact on the food and agriculture system and addressing the challenges of underrepresented populations in STEM careers. Most recently, he has been admitted in the 2022 class of senior members of the National Academy of Inventors, the world's best emerging academic inventors. Dr. Magee, welcome to the Policy Center Live podcast.
Thank you, Ms. Gray. It's my pleasure to be here.
What can't you do? We're going to delve into your inventions and all of that, but
what I can't do is give up on my passion of trying to get more African Americans into the STEM fields, especially the agricultural sciences, because there's a dire need to have folks of African American descent in these types of fields. And so my mission and goal professionally is to try to make certain we have a pipeline of young African Americans to pursue degrees and careers in these fields.
And we're definitely going to get to that. That is one of my questions. I want to start with the Policy Center and just kind of talk a little bit about our mission. And so the mission of the Policy Center is to conduct research, analyze policy, and make recommendations seeking to achieve equitable and economic integration of USDA programs and policies for socially disadvantaged farmers, ranchers, communities, and rural landowners. So we recently held our quarterly advisory board meeting in Biloxi. Talk about the significance and the importance of the Policy Center, and you, of course, serve as an advisory board member. So talk about its significance and how you became an advisory board member.
It is so significant, especially for farmers of color, and again, especially African American farmers, because we don't have a history of how some of the USDA policy impacted on the livelihood of African American farmers, okay? Now, I got involved because my family was a victim of some of these USDA policies starting back, let's say back in the Depression. So I grew up in the 50s and 60s and stuff, and I saw witness firsthand the main policy that I personally think that had the greatest impact on the decline of the African American farmers, USDA policy, was the allotment policies that they had. They started with cotton during the Depression, 1933, I believe, with the first farm bill, and the policy said, as you know, historically, in the 30s, well, let's back up. The apex of black land ownership took place in 1920 to 1930, that decade. In that decade, we had more than 900,000 African American farmers in this country. 14% of production agriculture consisted of African American farmers. African America owned more than 15 million acres of land, of farmland. Now, today we're down to fewer than 4 million, at least the last information I read on it. And we have fewer than 40,000 African American participating in production agriculture. Okay, about 1.4% of the actual farming population are African American. Now, in the 1950s, okay, they had the allotment system. The way the allotment system used to work, it started in 1933, during the Depression, okay? We had an overproduction of cotton. The prices was very low, okay? So USDA put this policy in place, okay, that we need to reduce essentially the numbers of acres of cotton, or the number of folks growing cotton, okay? So they said we put it basically, we'll put a policy in place so each farmer would be limited to a certain number of acres of cotton that they could grow, Okay, that way theoretically, then they will raise the prices. They will raise the price. Now, in the 1930s, in order to be a good cotton farmer, what did you need? You need good land. You need a knowledge of how to grow cotton, and you need a large labor pool. Well, and you also needed, like I said, an empirical, I use the word empirical knowledge. Well, black farmers, they had all of that because they were still coming out of slavery. All they had ever done was grow cotton,
Right.
and agricultural cotton and stuff. So they had an empirical knowledge, okay? Maybe they didn't have the book knowledge, but they knew how to grow cotton.
Right.
Okay, so black farmers, like I said, at the end of 1930, that was a peak land ownership. And so they put that policy in place, and shortly after they put the cotton allotment in place, then black land ownership started to go down, okay? Because, and black families had what? They had the knowledge, they had managed to buy good land, and they had a large family, a large labor pool, because we were still using manual labor and animal power to cultivate the field, which the white farmers didn't have that, to be honest about it and stuff. So, but anyway, so if you could not put your land in more cotton production, you wouldn't have an incentive to buy land.
Right.
You wouldn't have to, and there's some other factors too, but there were no incentive for black farmers to buy land. Now, in the 1950s, I grew up with my grandparents and stuff. We had 162 acres of land, okay? You know, clear land. My grandfather had clear title to the land. But he had 14 children, 9 boys and 5 girls, so he had a large labor pool, and he had a whole bunch of boys that could plow those mules, and a couple of grandkids like me could also have to plow that mule as well. Now, so the acreage reduction, they want acre reduction, so they would come. So the allotment system, the Secretary of Ag for the whole United States, they'll say that we're gonna grow, let's say, 30 million acres of cotton for this year at the national level. You know, cotton is in the South and Southwest mainly. So the Secretary will designate how many acres, then he will also allot, each state can grow, the cotton growing state, each state could grow, you know, a certain number of acres. And at the state level, they'll pass it down to the local county the local county committee. At that time, back in the 50s, at least during my time, it was called the ASCS, Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service. Now they go at the FSA, you know, that's the committee.
Right.
At the local level, that committee, all powerful, they make the decision how much land will be allotted to each farmer in that county. And the reality of what I observed, even as an adolescent and a teenager, what I observed, the white farmers in the same county, they got the big allotment. The black farmer got the smallest amount. They almost had to give you a minimum amount. Okay, now, and so in the 1950s, when they passed the Farm Bill in the 1956, there was 2 ways to do it, to reduce the number of acres of cotton. And other commodities that would be in the allotment program, your basic commodities in the allotment program, even in the 1950s, they had corn, they had wheat, they had cotton, they had tobacco, they had rice, and they had peanuts. Now, in the 1950s, they took out 2 of the commodities. They took out wheat and they took out corn. But they left mainly these crops that are mainly in the South, where you had 95% of your black farmers, okay, so they kept it for cotton, they kept it for peanuts, they kept it for tobacco, and they kept it for rice. Now, if they give you an allotment, let's use an example, like in the case of my grandfather. He may have had, 25 acres allotted. I'm just using a number. I don't remember the exact acreage that he had. So if you got 14 children, you're gonna plant all 25 acres in cotton, because that's your main source of income. Now, so if they allot my grandfather 25 acres, and let's say my white neighbor, most of them didn't have any children or maybe 1 or 2 children, they may allot them an allotment of 50 acres. Now, when they allot the land, the acreage, it's 2 ways they can do it. As far as reducing for acreage reduction, you have what we call acreage reserve, and you have conservation reserve. The difference in those 2 terminology, which USDA found out very soon after they did this, 1956 is when they passed the Agricultural Act for that year. But anyway, so in the acreage reserve, if you take, say, we're going to allot you 25 acres, and you can say, I'm going to take 5 of these acres out of the allotment program. 25 acres for cotton. Okay, I won't plant all 25 acres. I plant 20 acres of it, and I put the other 5 in the parity program. In other words, what that means is, they will pay you based on your previous years up to 90% of the cotton that you would have made, you would have grown, if you had planted. So they'll pay you, you would be getting a check for like 90% of what the yield would have been. Okay, now, but with the black farmers, you already got the minimum number of acres, so you're going to still plant your whole 25 acres. So if the white farmer had 50 acres, and that 50, they said, I am going to put 10 acres in the acreage reserve. And getting to the difference now, there are 2 ways you could do. In the acreage reserve, so if they take 10 acres out of cotton, nothing to stop them from putting them into watermelons or cabbage or something else, some other commodity that is not in the acreage reserve. So they're still using that land to make money, and also they get 90% of what they would have been making. And so if the black farmers didn't put any in there, certainly they won't get a check. And I think I may have stated one time at the Policy Center, in the 1950s, during the Jim Crow days, black folks didn't have any checking accounts. I mean, you may have had, colored water fountains, colored waiting room, but I don't think they had a colored section in your local bank. I know they did, because they didn't have any checking account. But the point I'm making is, so that black farmer, he said, I still got let's say use my grandfather, I still got to plant enough cotton to feed and take care of these, so I got to plant all 25 acres.
Right.
And even if you wanted to get in the parity section of it, the other component where they would pay you for taking it out, that was in the hand of the local county committee as well.
Oh, wow.
Okay? So when we talk about systemic racism, you have to look at these policies and analyze. In 1933, when they first started the cotton allotment system, those ag economists, which were all white, they had to know how this was going to impact. You could have predicted how it was going to impact on the black farmers and stuff. And so that 900,000 farmers, today we're down to what we say fewer than 40,000 of these farmers and stuff. So systemic racism, it comes up in a lot of different ways. Now, the other component, the other way they did it in the 1950s, you had acreage reserve, and then you had a conservation acreage. If you go the conservation route, that same white farmer say, I'm taking my 10 acres out of cotton production, I'm gonna put it into the conservation reserve. When you put soil conservation is what it's talking about. That means that you couldn't plant anything on it. But you can draw that parity check really up to 10 years. When you get in that program, say for 10 years, if I don't grow anything on this land, I don't do anything with it on this land, I'm gonna be getting this check for 10 years. Now, and so in other words, the parity or the allotment system, that was intangible property. If you say in the conservation reserve portion, you can say, I'm gonna put the white farmer, well, the black farmer too, if they had allowed them to do it, I'm gonna put my whole 50 acres into the cotton, in the reserve for cotton. I'm not gonna farm this land. I'm gonna move up to New York or wherever, and I'm gonna keep growing this check.
Right.
Yeah, so that's what I'm talking about. So very few, if any, of the black farmers, at least in my county, were getting these parity check. That 75, well, at that time it was 90% of parity. Now, again.
Hold that thought, Dr. Mcgee.
Okay.
So let me ask you then, since we are down to less than 40,000 farmers, black farmers, and
it's under
less than 4 million acres of land left, how do we retain the land that the black farmers have and just keep the farmers that are in place? What's the key to that?
The key to that, try to get more younger and more educated young black African American into the food and agriculture system, because the average African American, not only just young one, if I say agriculture to a black person in this country, you thinking cow plows and sows and tilling hard work and no money in it.
Correct.
Yeah, and no money, but it is a lot of money in it. And we just don't realize that. And unless we can expose and educate our younger generation, that it is a good career choice to go. See, if we only have 1.4% of African American participating in production agriculture, which is farming. Don't get me wrong, because it's the foundation. We got to get these commodities from someplace before we convert them to corn flakes and corn starch and corn sugar. It has to come from that field, okay? Now, so I recruit a lot of students for biological and agriculture systems engineering. That's what the program used to call. Our program used to be called biological and agricultural systems engineering. Because of the negative stigma attached to agriculture, we dropped the agriculture. We still teach the same stuff now. We dropped the agriculture, and now we call it biological systems engineering. Because they take biology in high school. See, because this type of engineering is a biology-based engineering field, okay? And so we just dropped the agriculture part, because the moment I say to you that, we want you to major in agricultural engineering, they don't make the connection that all those products that you see in the supermarkets, it take a whole bunch of engineering. I like to say all the time, how much engineering does it take to go from kernels of corn to corn flakes, or frosted flakes?
Right. And
we are the engineers that basically make that happen and stuff, okay? You can buy a head of cabbage any time of year you want to, but we teach you, we know in agriculture and biological engineering, how to put them in the right environment to keep them for 6 months. Okay. We can get apples any time of year because they store them in a controlled environment. And that's the kind of stuff I teach, in bioprocessing food, my courses and stuff. But anyway, so what we need to happen is to change the negative image of agriculture. But because of our past history with slavery, the plantation system and sharecropping, no black Americans, a lot of parents tell me all the time, I'm not going to pay, it costs about $36,000 a year for an out-of-state student to attend FAMU. Okay. I'm not going to pay for $36,000 for my kid to come out to learn how to be a farmer. And my retort, when they say that, I have to ask them, how many black farmers do you know?
Right.
I bet the person that's watching this podcast or this video, they can't name.
Not many.
Not many. You can't name 5 folks.
I know a few now, but
you know a few.
Now.
I bet you don't know more than 5. I'm talking about make their living full time.
I do not. You're right.
But we don't think that way as African Americans anymore. So, see, most of our African Americans, a lot of them migrated from the South in the 40s and 50s because of the jobs opportunity. The steel mills, the car industry, and so you got a lot of black folks in the urban area, especially in the North and Midwest and the Northeast, they are still thinking it's a whole bunch of African-American farmers down in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. And like I say, they not down south, nor are they up south either. Okay.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Mcgee. So let's discuss the history of land grant systems in 1890s universities. Because I don't think a lot of black people really understand the difference between an 1862 university and an 1890 university. I'm guilty of that as well. But just kind of talk about the history of the land grant system in 1890.
FAMU is an 1890 land grant university.
What does that mean?
Yeah, what they think they're talking about. FAMU is one of 1,890 universities. It's a date, is what it is.
Right.
It's a date when the Morrill Act was passed, okay? Now let's give it a little bit of brief history. Okay, the land grant system, we call it the land grant system. There are components that make up a tripartite, it's what we use that term, in the land grant system. And to be honest, the land grant system made this country the greatest country in the world, to be honest, because we can produce, process, harvest, market, transport, food and fiber better than any other country. And it's mainly due to the land grant system. And I like to say, in order to become a great nation or a great country, there are two things you have to do. You must be able to feed your people, and then you got to educate them.
Yes.
And that land grant system made it possible. Now, there was a whole lot of collateral damage done, and so they don't like to talk about the collateral damage. But the land grant system in the 1850s, it was a merchant up in the state of Vermont named Justin Smith Morrill. Because we named the Morrill Act 1, Morrill Act 2, this first Morrill Act and the second Morrill Act. So in the 1850s, he was a merchant. He used to sell tools and, plows and axes and, shovels and all of that to the farmers. And so he noticed that the farmers for the first 3 years, and we were using a slash and burn type agriculture. We'd take a piece of land, cut the trees down, the bushes, the grasses, and burn it. Then they, clear it. Then we would cultivate it, and we were plant it in corn, corn or whatever, vegetables and stuff like that. Okay, for the first 3 years, you're gonna get high yield because we were doing organic farming essentially. Because the organic material, you had good, rich land. We didn't have artificial fertilizer, chemical-based fertilizer. Because fertilizer is made from oil, from the price of oil and crude oil. They come from fertilizer. But anyway, so he noticed that the farmers, the first 3 years, their potatoes and whatever, carrots or whatever they were growing, the yield would be very high essentially for the first 3 years. So then after the third year, it started to go down because the crops had done what? Depleted the fertilizer, the nutrients in the soil, the organic nutrients. And we didn't have chemical-based fertilizer on a large scale at that time to put it back in. And so anyway, this guy, Justin Smith Morrill, he got elected to Congress, I believe, in 1853. And in 1853, the mid-18, in that period of time, more than 80%, it wasn't an agrarian society, meaning 80% or more of the population derived its living, from farming and stuff. And so when he got to Congress in 1853, 1854, don't hold me to the exact date, but when he got to Congress, he introduced a bill. He would call it the Agricultural Land Grant College Bill, Act, or whatever. He said for every state, we should have at least one institution of higher learning in addition to teaching the classical arts and the liberal arts, law and medicine and all of that. Because at that time, we only had a couple hundred university colleges in the U.S., and it was for rich, elite white males and stuff. He said that we need to establish at least one institution in each state. In each state, we only had about 29 or 30 states at that time. And in addition to teaching the classical studies, we need him to also teach agriculture and the mechanical arts and military tactics. So we need at least one university. Now the bill, that was in 1857 when it got introduced. Okay, 1854 when it got introduced, I believe, but 1857 it passed Congress, okay, the House of Representatives. Then, as you know, a bill, then it goes over to the Senate, okay? And in 1859, it passed the Senate, okay, passed the Senate. So both the House and the Senate, now it goes to where? To the president for his signature. The president at that time was James Buchanan, James Buchanan was a pro-slavery president, even though he was from the state of Pennsylvania, but he believed in slavery. But anyway, so the Southern senators and congressmen, they went to him, they lobbied him, said, Mr. President, you need to veto this bill because if you pass this bill, this is the first step towards dismantling slavery. Okay, that's what it was about, because in 1859, the country, as you know, you had free states and slave states. The country was divided, and that was the big political issue. And so they convinced him that you need to veto this bill, okay? Even though the bill said nothing about slaves or race or anything, right. Okay? So it got vetoed in 1859. Buchanan vetoed it, and they knew that he would do it because the famous Dred Scott case with this slave in Missouri, he had been free. He had gone to New York with his master, so he was a free slave. He came back to Missouri, and the master died, and the wife wanted to keep him in slavery, and Dred Scott filed suit in Missouri, said he should be a free man now because he was free. Yeah, and so what I'm saying, that Buchanan administration had lobbied the Supreme Court to keep him. He could not be a citizen because he's property. In other words, he's not a human, essentially. So Buchanan, so the Southerners politicians knew he would be an ally. But anyway, so in 1859, the big political divide, free states versus, and so Abraham Lincoln, he was running to be president as a Republican. He was a Republican from the state of Illinois. You know, originally came from Kentucky, moved to Illinois, Springfield, Illinois, I believe. And he's promised that he said that when he was campaigning, if I were to become president and if you present this bill to me, I will sign this Land Grant College Act that Congressman Moore had introduced. So shortly after that, he did get to be president in 1861. The 11 southern states seceded from the Union because they wanted to keep slavery in place. You know, they give you a different version these days, but the bottom line, they wanted to maintain slavery. So then, after that happened, in 1862, the December of 1861, Moore reintroduced the bill because now you got 11 southern states, so you no longer had as many congressmen and senators. So in December 1861, it passed Congress. And then in July, I believe June of 1862, after the bill was signed off by the Senate, and in July 2nd of 1862, it went to President Lincoln, and he signed, and it became the first Morrill Act, the Morrill Act. And that Morrill Act said that in each of these states, we would grant you so much land. If you didn't already have an academic institution teaching agriculture and mechanical arts, we would grant you a certain number of acres of land for you to sell, and you could use this proceed to build a new college, a new college where you had to teach agriculture, the mechanical arts, and military science. Now, some of these schools were already in existence. So Michigan State received the first charter, because Michigan State started in 1855, and they were already teaching agriculture, but at the state level. And the government said, we would give you so much money in order to hire the teacher, do the labs, all of that. Now, that was in July of 1862. See, these things are tied together. In May of 1862, there are two significant acts were signed into law, two significant bills. They established the United States Department of Agriculture. In May 15th, 5 days later, they passed the Homestead Act of 1862.
That's where that comes from.
That's what, under President Lincoln, the Homestead Act said that basically, they didn't quite put it that way in writing. This is 1862. Basically, for any white, you didn't have to be a U.S. citizen. Any citizen, they were really talking about white males. Any white citizen, you didn't have to be a citizen either, or any male, they didn't use the word, or any person of the United States with the intent of becoming a citizen, we will give you 160 acres of land, and you got to homestead it for 5 years, okay, number one, you got to make out an application because in 1860, they wanted to develop the lands west of the Mississippi River, lands what they had appropriated from the Indians, okay? The Department of Interior, okay, now before that, in this country, they passed an actual law that said it was called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Now, they had taken all this land and made it federal land, and so it said that if you want to, in order to develop the West agriculturally, we would give you 160 acres of land. We would allocate to you 160 acres, and you must homestead this land for 5 years, meaning that you got to put a house on it, and you got to have a farm enterprise on it. So basically, they give you this land, you go out there and put, I don't know, like a shack, and you call it a house, essentially. 150 square foot, house, and you say it's your home. You grow a garden on it, or you can plant some corn or potatoes. And after 5 years, if you stay there, they're gonna give you clear title to that land. Now, it did not apply to, naturally, the Civil War was going on.
Correct.
So Black Americans or the former slaves could not participate.
Right.
Chinese Americans, they couldn't participate in the Homestead Act. And Native Americans couldn't participate, even though the U.S. had taken the land from the Native Americans, but they wouldn't give any of it back. So those are the three groups that couldn't participate. So that's what the Homestead Act did. And so in the Homestead Act, the first one in 1862, and they closed this act. They stopped doing it in 1976. So for 114 years, basically, mostly white males from Europe, they could get this.
They benefited.
They could benefit. So when you talk about generational wealth, you have to look at stuff like that. You have to analyze these policies and these acts and stuff. Everything was in favor of the European white man, essentially what it boiled down to. And so under the Homestead Act, then they passed different versions of it later on. The U.S., they gave these folks 270 million acres of land. 10% of all the land that's in the U.S., they got this land through the Homestead Act. Now, and it was mainly land west of the Mississippi River, okay? Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa, Montana, to get these folks to come and homestead, okay? Now, and so even after the Civil War was over in 1865, it still didn't apply to the former slaves.
Okay.
Because even after the Civil War was over, they were still not classified as citizens.
Right.
Okay. Now, so and we were in a dire situation. Okay, the former slaves essentially. So even if you said I'm gonna participate in the Homestead Act, okay, the former slaves, some of you politicians, they can get some of this land too. But think about it. You have to apply for the land, make an application, a written application. How many former slaves you think could read? And nobody, no white person, I won't say no white person, they were not going to teach you how to fill out an application. It almost like this thing going on with the distress loans today. The big issue today, as you know through the Policy Center, the distress loan, you got to do a 40-page application. But anyway, so the number one, you had to do an application. Then number two, you had to do what? You had to live on the land, and you had to have a house on it, and then you had to farm the land. So after the Civil War was over, the former slaves didn't have anything.
Right. They
couldn't read, they couldn't write, they didn't have a mule, they didn't have a horse, they didn't have a wagon, they didn't have any plow, they didn't have, even if they could get the land, because most of this land was west of the Mississippi River. So if you lived in James Island, South Carolina, how you gonna get out to jump off Nebraska?
Correct.
There were about 4 million former slaves. They didn't have an education, they didn't have any property, so you got a social calamity
Right.
on your hand.
Right.
They're just not going to lay down and die.
Right.
And die. Okay. So the same Congressman, Justice Smith Morris, said we need to establish a set of schools for the former slaves and their descendants in order for them to learn to read and write, and they could be educated in agriculture so they could feed themselves. That was the essence of it. And so in 1872, he introduced, that was the Second Morrill Act, said we're going to establish a similar set of schools where we can educate our former slaves and their descendants, because naturally former slaves couldn't attend these white schools. Correct. not only in the South, but even in the North,
right.
they were not allowed to participate,
right.
to go to school. And so 1872, he introduced a second bill to try to establish this. He introduced it 11 more times up until 1890. Finally, he was a senator then, a powerful senator, and the Southern politician and the Southern white land-grant school wanted more money for their program. That's the bottom line. And so they couldn't get it passed unless Morrill agreed to it. So they decided to compromise. And so Morrill told them basically, I will support your bill if you agree, you support my bill to establish a set of schools that would teach agriculture and mechanical art to the former slaves and their descendants. And in August of 1890, they passed, and that became known as the Second Morrill Act of 1890. So that's why Florida A&M, Famu, and Alcorn, and Fort Valley State, and Tuskegee. That's why these schools that's why we call them 1890 land-grant schools. Now, that's misnomer if you call it. If you say it's a land-grant school, wouldn't you think that they were granted some land?
Yes, sir.
Well, only one state got granted land to establish such a school. The state of Mississippi is the only one that I know. Alcorn, that the state was granted about 210,000 acres of land, because you could sell the land and you could use the money to build an institution, but that you had to teach agriculture and mechanical art. So now, if we got the first Morrill Act, then you got a second Morrill Act, just by logical thinking, you would think that if you're going to pass a second Morrill Act,
right.
whatever you had incorporated in the first one,
you would put it in the second one.
Well, that didn't happen. In the second Morrill Act, they gutted the Morrill Act. Because in the first Morrill Act, the way the formula that they used to grant this land, they would grant to each state 30,000 acres per federal representative. Since each state has to have at least, 3 representatives. When I say representative, you got to have 2 senators and 1 congressperson, okay? And so 30,000 acres. So that means at a minimum, each state would be granted 90,000 acres of land to sell, okay? Now, and you can use that money to endow the money in any U.S. stocks or bonds or whatever that guarantee 5%. So even a state where you already had a school, you didn't have to build a new school, so you can take your 100,000 acres of land, you can sell it, and you can put it in an endowment, and it's going to be generating interest, and then you compound that over the years. So they had a real good foundation to build up on money-wise and stuff. Now, when they got to the Second Morrill Act, and you could get from 90,000 up to 1 million acres of land. They had a ceiling on it, 1 million. Well, in the Second Morrill Act, what you think they took out? These 1890 schools in the states that they're in, they were not granted the 90,000 acres at a minimum. In the Second Morrill Act, all we got was the right to teach agriculture.
Oh, wow.
That's all we got. That's it. And on top of that, they would not even allow us to conduct agricultural research. See, the 1890 schools, we did not get any kind of funding from USDA to teach agriculture, to do agricultural research until 1967. That was about 80 years?
Right, right.
Now, and the thing about that, see, we said the tripartite, of the land grant system, you got teaching, research, outreach, or extension. So when they passed the first land grant, the first Morrill Act, it was mainly for teaching. They could hard teach. They get it. The USDA would give these schools money to hard teachers, buy equipment, supplies, and develop labs. Now think about it. In the 1860s, the knowledge base for agriculture was a European-based knowledge. In other words, coming from Scotland, England, and places like that, they brought their knowledge and they were teaching. Well, agriculture is based on what? Local climate, local soils, okay, local animals, okay. And so in 1887, they said, we need to generate new knowledge in order for these teachers, land grant schools, to be able to teach it in the classroom. So they passed the Hatch Act, the Hatch Experiment Station Act. It's a matching deal. In each state, under the 1862s, you got these agricultural experiment stations located in different parts of the state, and the state will put up a certain amount of money, and the federal government will give them money to run these research stations, and each state would have to match it, a dollar-to-dollar match. But the state can put in as much money as they want to put in. Now, in 1887, the Hatch Act was passed. Okay, so that's considered the second leg of the tripartite that we talk about. Okay, but in the bill, in the act, it said you can only schools under the 1862 charter could have experiment station. Now, the reason why I'm saying that, because we hadn't got to 1890, because that bill hadn't passed, passed. But the problem they had, you had two historically black schools in 1887. They came in under the 1862 Act. Alcorn State University,
wow.
And believe it or not, Hampton University used to be a historically black land grant university.
Is that right?
That's right, Alcorn. So now you got a legal problem, essentially.
Okay.
If you say we're going to pass this Hatch Act and we're going to give money for these experiment stations, we're going to give money to these schools that got the 1862 charter. So now, if you did not give money to Alcorn and Hampton, now you got to explain, because they got 1862 charter. But it specifically said only the white schools were 1862 charter. So you talking about discrimination and all of that. And so now, so you had two historically black schools at that time in 1887. Eventually you had four historically black schools to come in with 1862 charters. Under the 1862 charter, you had Alcorn. It was the Alcorn University at the time they came in. You got Hampton, Claflin College in South Carolina, because they didn't give it to South Carolina State, because the state of South Carolina legislature said, no, we're not going to agree to these terms, and so they gave it to this, a small black private college, and I think Kentucky State. So you had two 1890s, two state colleges and two private colleges, black one. They actually at one time had 1862 charter under the first Morrill Act. So in 1890, after they passed the second Morrill Act, excuse me, after they passed the second Morrill Act, these four colleges, it was three of them, I believe, at that time, because South Carolina State, they didn't take their charter until 1896. But anyway, so now those black colleges that had 1862 charters, they were literally forced, now they got changed over to 1890s, because now you won't be looking at in a litigation. If you pass something that you only want the 1862, you could say it, okay? But if you still got these four black colleges, and now that would be blatant, overt discrimination. They said, no, we're not going to allow Alcorn to do research. We're not going to allow Alcorn to do extension, because they could not do extension nor research. As I said, the 1890 bill said you got the right to teach agriculture, but you cannot do agricultural research and you cannot do agricultural outreach.
That is truly astounding. What are your thoughts about the Farm Bill, and just what were some of the discussions based around our advisory board meeting?
Well, one I remember the most with the Farm Bill and some of the policy, the one about if you participate in let's say, a loan program, crop insurance or whatever, a loan program with USDA through one of the agencies, whether it's FSA, I don't know whether they handle loans directly. But the black farmers saying that if I need $50,000 as an operating loan to run my farm, so I got to borrow this loan, okay. Certainly, local private banks not going to loan a black farmer $50,000. I'm just using 50. It costs you that much because you got to buy seed, you got to buy diesel, you got to buy fertilizer. Okay, so USDA they got some direct loan program. But if you got 200 acres of land on your farm, you want to borrow this $50,000, and if you got to put up 200 acres of land with your house on it just to borrow $50,000, there's something wrong with that equation because that 200 acres of land is far more valuable than that $50,000 loan. And so what I'm saying, if it turns out that you cannot pay the loan back and you use your land and your house for collateral, which may be valued at $400,000, and you lose your $400,000 just because you couldn't put up, because you had to use your whole land and home as collateral to borrow $50,000. I'm just using an example.
Right.
It's something wrong with that, In other words, why is it I can only put up? It should be a case where I only have to put up 25 acres of my land as collateral, and just in case, I cannot pay the loan back, all you will get with the 25 acres, not my house and my whole 200 acres and stuff. And so in the Farm Bill, I think that's one of the recommendations, being made and stuff, okay? Natural, by me being in academia, within that Farm Bill, we want the amount of revenue funding to go to the 1890 schools to increase from, I think it may be like 35% for research. We wanted to get it up to 40% for research, and the same thing for extension, if I recall correctly. Now, the Farm Bill is so important because so many African Americans, they don't understand. It's really not a farm bill. That's what we call it. 80%, at least 80% of the Farm Bill it's a nutrition bill, okay? But they want you to think it's a farm bill. And so when you hear the politicians say, oh, we're gonna cut the $10 billion out of the SNAP program. That's an acronym. How many folks know what you're talking about? So if you walk through your living room and the TV said the politician have voted to, they're gonna say cut it by $10 billion. You say, oh, that doesn't concern me. But they don't know what's in there. When you use that word SNAP, they don't know what you're talking about. You're talking about the school lunch program, the school breakfast program, you're talking about the WIC program, you're talking about a whole bunch of programs that's going to impact your life. One of the things that I don't like, when they have these listening sessions, most of the time USDA, they're going to have it in these small rural towns. And if you happen to go to one of the listening sessions, yeah, you're going to have mostly farmers, but you're going to also have the manager at the local supermarket there as well. Because when you go in that supermarket, they got these WIC tags on. That's going to impact them. So if the bill is about nutrition, school lunch, school breakfast, why don't you hold some of the listening session in these urban area or at the 1890s, at least some of the 1890s. Now, they may hold some of them there, I don't know, but I don't know of too many of them. But they don't hold these listening sessions in the urban, and the folks that some of these programs are going to have the greatest impact on, they don't bother to come to the listening session because, again, if you say I'm going to cut SNAP, they think you're talking about cutting an apple juice company or something similar to that. But again, it's not really, the name shouldn't be a farm bill, it should be some kind of nutrition bill. But for political reasons, it started out as being the farm bill. Only about 20% of the money in that bill is going to end up going to farmers for, price support. When we say price support, that's kind of a fancy name for kind of like a welfare system too. In other words, if you can't, if you got selling wheat or corn, and basically on the price support, if you can't get, I don't know, $7 per bushel on the private market, and you can only get $5, the price support really means simplifying that the government will give you these other $2 to make up for it. A lot of times during the farm bill, they're going to tell, if we don't pass the farm bill, milk is going to go up to $9 a gallon if we don't pass it. But when you go to the supermarket, you might pay only $4 a gallon. Where the farmers, what happened to that other $5? That's the price support. The government is saying to the dairy folks instead of the dairy farmer, well, don't worry about it. We'll give you this other $5 to make it that difference for you to make a profit or to continue in operation. I'm simplifying it, but that's the kind of stuff they be talking about when they say price support.
Okay.
And things like all of that is in the farm bill and stuff. But it touches your life in so many ways that you don't even think about. And most folks in the urban area, black and white, they don't, they say, oh, that's for farmers and stuff. That doesn't impact me. It does impact you and stuff.
Thank you to our guest, Dr. Charles Mcgee, for joining me today. And thank you for the viewers watching. Scan the QR code to follow the Policy Center on all our social media platforms, Facebook, IG, and Twitter. And be sure to subscribe, like, and share our YouTube channel at the Policy Center Live to watch this episode as well as previous episodes. We'll see you next time on the Policy Center Live.